Well, welcome everyone. This is our first master class of our Product Mastery Now community. So thanks to those joining live and to you watching it later. We had some early interest when I asked about topics about involving stakeholders and how do we influence stakeholders. And we had a podcast episode on that last week to help address that a little bit. And then I reached out to my good friend, Dr. John Latham, to talk about this more. He knows an awful lot about indeed herding stakeholders and trying to create value for all stakeholders involved in a project. And at the bigger picture level, this really involves is how is the actual organization structured to influence stakeholders, and how are they part of the overall organization. So we wanted to start first with looking at, well, how do we back up and design an organization, or maybe redesign an organization to be more effective? This is something that John has had extensive experience with, helping organizations transform, doing research on organizations transform, and evaluating organizations transforming as well, and has incredible resources to actually help with a redesign of an organization or design from scratch. So I think this will put together some pieces for us and provide a good framework for indeed how can we influence stakeholders better from a organizational design perspective. So John, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Chad. Thanks for having me, and good to be here and talk about organization design, which is my favorite topic. Really is, and the main reason it's my favorite topic is I've just run into over the years so many poorly designed organizations, or less than reach their potential, I guess, design, and found that I was often conflicted in organizations, receiving multiple messages and wasn't sure quite what to do, just seemed inconsistent. A lot of people, when they think of organization design, they think of organization structure, the organization chart, reporting relationships. And that's certainly part of my perspective on organization design. Other people think of process and procedures and designing systems, and that's been a large influence as well. But what I'm going to present today and offer up is a way of looking at organization design that's a bit broader than that. But it starts at the same place all organization design starts, which is we're really hoping to get some particular results or outcomes out of what we do as leaders or managers of organizations. And that affects all the different stakeholders. And we do a lot of stuff in organizations to try to make that happen. We design the way work is done. We lead in a particular way. We say certain things and have a certain style. We develop strategies, goals, and objectives. We have scorecards, we measure stuff, and then we develop incentives behind that. We have culture that we work on, and all kinds of policies and things like that. All of those, we're expecting to get certain results. And what we often forget is that none of those things directly create any results. The people in the organization create the results, and all of these things we do to lead the people are influencing them. But we often forget that they have to then translate these messages and then apply them. And so the stuff on the far left is the things we design, and that's what they see and hear. And then that affects what they think and feel about what they saw and heard. And then that affects what they do and say, or their behavior. And that's what creates the results. So when I think about organization design, and on the far left, there are the things that we can design, I think about it from a very large perspective, all of the messages that are being received by individuals in the organization. And if you think about, your life in an organization, there's many things. We come to work, and there's often some very specific policies about how we do our work, and maybe some instructions and some tools that they've given us. And then there's leaders that are telling us what the priorities are and how to do work and giving us feedback. Then there's our peers, the culture, the group that also is telling us what the norms are and what the expectations are. And then we see the incentive scheme, et cetera. All of those messages are affecting what we see and hear, how we think and feel about that, and then what we do and say. And of course, there's no standard answer to this middle piece. And because individuals are not standard, and as you already, as you know, they come in infinite variety, and when they don't obey any immutable natural laws of science, and so their behavior is quite diverse. You put them in groups, and the permutations are really nearly endless. So the complexity of design, organizations are complex, whether we like it or not. And I would suggest to you that many of the designs I've seen in the past, the pieces were designed by different people, all with good intentions, all based on good knowledge about that particular discipline or functional area. Unfortunately, when you put them together, they often don't work well. And so this far left list, I find it useful to think about this in a little more of a diagram perspective. And I always start with the standard things of designing what it is we're going to do for the customers, either internal or external, and what are the activities that need to produce those outputs. And then eventually, what do we need as inputs to make those activities work? This is pretty standard, nothing really new here, but it's the core of where I start really with any organizational design issue, because the customer, internal or external, where the reason we've come together in an organization is that we need multiple people to work together to produce something for that customer. And so this is where I start and get this kind of started aligning and integrating first, and then layer in what I often call enablers, which are the workforce, the measurement system, and the culture. And the workforce, we need people with certain knowledge, skills, abilities in order to do these activities. And so we need, we design for them to make it easy in the first place, but we also need to look at, how they're developed. Do changes need to be made in the development? Is it adequate for what we're doing? What's the incentive system looking like? I don't know about you guys, but many times to redesign something, launched it, deployed it, did everything we thought made sense to do for a successful change in the organization, and found out that many of the people didn't do it the new way we had designed. And when we start investigating further, we find out that something else is more important than those instructions we gave them, like the incentive system, like peer pressure on the culture or whatever, or sometimes what their leaders telling them. They made a difference. And so when we look at these other factors, we look at the alignment and integration of them, so that our core design is designed in a way that makes sense with those other factors. And sometimes through collaboration, we change the other factors. So sometimes we redo the incentive system to make sense with what we're trying to accomplish. Same way with scorecard. We're talking about really everything that's measured, from suppliers to the activities, outputs, and the customers. And how is this entire work activity measured so that we can manage it and know how well it's working, which ultimately becomes the test of, do we have a good design or not? And then the last enabler I look at is the culture, which at the core are the values that the organization is hoping to have in a culture, and the values that are embedded in the culture. But we don't really see values directly. They're hidden. What we see are the manifestations of the values in what people do, rituals. We don't usually use that word in organizations, but that's common practices and common ways we run meetings, do offsites, have celebrations. Those are all rituals. Symbols, which I need to edit and misspell, heroes and practices. All of those things affect, how we do things and are equally part of the design. And the last thing I look at is the more of the guidance perspective from the leadership. What do they do, say, what are their activities, and are they consistent with and helping this, and what needs to happen. Same way with strategies that aligned with where we're going as an organization and our goals, and finally the governance aspect, which are all the legal, ethical, regulatory perspectives, and including sustainability for whatever it is we're designing. And so these become kind of the overall dimensions, if you will. But really, at the end of the day, it's all information, right? And these are different media sources that have different information that an individual doing an activity in the middle is exposed to those messages from those sources. And so when you think about organizations and organization design, we're really designing the information that people see, both the content of the information and the way in which it's presented, and how it's presented. And sometimes we talk about organizations as if they are some entity, when in fact, they're really a concept. They don't technically exist. There's a lot of artifacts in organizations, but there's not really any such thing as an organization other than in the minds of the people there. So it's this organizing function, if you will, which from our design perspective is largely designing the information and how that's done. And so I take this diagram as kind of the jumping off point and look at it is from a component perspective and guidance of how do we do these things and what are the activities we would do as designers, and how would we go about that. And you take, identify what goes in each one of these boxes and the alignment and integration of that. As you might imagine, when you do these activities, it's bigger than the box, right? So there's going to be a lot of stuff that goes into these. So this is more of an organizing framework for the design of any particular activity and outputs. And typically, when you expand this on a whiteboard or use the pieces that you've created as a design team, this can get quite large, and then you want to boil it down to some simple, straightforward things. This is fairly generic. How it actually plays out is different every single time, and this is not meant to be a prescriptive approach, but more of a tool to help evoke and think about the key factors. But how you think about them ends up to be a custom design for that particular organization. When you look at this, and this is really the design step of a design process. It raises a lot of questions about, we need a lot of information and a lot of knowledge just to do these activities. And that's where the whole design process comes in. So we've been talking about the design step, but there's a whole discovery process that goes on prior to being ready to deal with all those different dimensions directly. We start with a design brief up in the upper left-hand corner. That sets, leadership intent, the benefits that are expected, the system and the scope of what's, inbounds and out of bounds, all of which often are evolved as the design project unfolds, going back to whoever is the sponsor of this project. And then once we understand the task and the purpose and why we're doing that, we move on to understanding stakeholder requirements. And that's where we take 6 stakeholder groups: the customers, the workforce, the suppliers and partners, along with the financial perspective of investors, and the community and natural environment, and use those 6 boxes to go through and understand how whatever it is we're designing affects those stakeholders and is influenced by those stakeholders, and understand the requirements. Every one of those 6 doesn't always play out for everything we're designing, but when you look at it from an organizational perspective, they do. And so we ask those, look at those 6 perspectives every time and what shows up will be different every time. And then we look at the nature of activities, and this is where it's really important, and where many mistakes have been made in the past in organization design, is not understanding the nature of the activity, because this is what influences the amount and type of structure that will build into the systematic methods that we define and create. And oftentimes, we've got, things on one end of the spectrum, we've got physical things that like bending metal, mixing chemicals, things like that, that do obey the immutable natural laws of science. And so that we have even laws about how they behave. If we're dealing with work or activities that involve those types of things, then we can be pretty detailed, prescriptive, create procedures. And but on the other end of the spectrum is a systematic method for strategy development. And that we really don't, is more of a creative process. And so if we over-engineer or design that with too much structure, then we end up with not a very effective strategy system, because we're looking for an approach that provides some structure for smart people to do cool things and managerial judgment to come out in a strategy process. But we are not looking to constrain them, because we haven't figured out a way to do that. So those are kind of the ends of the spectrum. There's a lot in between. And this is where we see individuals will have a background in a particular educational discipline, have a view of the world that might be more natural sciences versus social sciences. Organizations are all social science. So from that perspective, we're always dealing with the unpredictability and lack of consistency in the social process. But sometimes we're doing work that does involve physical. So we deal with this step early so that we can not fall into the trap of thinking we can over-engineer something that shouldn't be over-engineered, and get a bad name. And I suspect you've experienced, I know I have, many organizations that over-designed or put too much structure into activities that needed to be creative, and it constrained and gave systems a bad name. In fact, bureaucracy, Max Weber's concept, was originally intended to be a good thing. And who could argue with a well-ordered systematic organization? Well, all the people involved, I guess, would be the ones that would argue with that, because it just, putting too much structure in bureaucracy now means almost universally a negative thing, because it slows us down. So the trick to creating designs that don't slow us down, still, make our activities explicit, shareable, improvable, but yet don't constrain, is understanding what the nature is of what it is, the activities that are involved, which can vary in a particular design. Part of it might be creative, another part might be physical, et cetera. And then we look at, once we understand those things, we look at the theories and research so that we understand what works, what doesn't work, under what conditions, and we can avoid learning again what we already know, and we have a higher probability of getting to a workable design that's successful quicker. And so that's why we use it, realizing that all organizational research has limitations. And like I said before, in social science, we don't have laws, because we never have the context is so important that we use this, theories and research as input, but it's not, in organizations as such where we know exactly how to do it. It's more of informing our design process. And sometimes we might do things that the research doesn't support, because we think we have a different context in a situation that hasn't yet been researched fully. Same thing goes for the inspiring examples in the bottom right-hand corner. We look at other examples of similar systems. So just like an architect would take a trip to Europe to study the architecture, to become inspired and informed by different characteristics and styles and things like that. We look at other systems and study them, and then draw from those to help inform our design. And eventually we stop and look at the unique context. A lot of people ask why we don't do this up front. We do a little bit in the design brief, but until we know what we're designing and what's included and those types of things, we don't know what about the context is relevant and important. And so once we have a pretty good idea of where we're going with this, then we look at the context. And we only look at what's relevant and important. The context, we could write pages and talk for days about the context of the organization, but not everything in the organizational context affects the particular thing we're designing, or at least usually not. And so we understand the internal and external context factors, and then identify the design principles, which we start with a standard set of 8, and then add to those as we see fit. And then we look at how this system fits in the other systems in the organization, how these activities, inputs and outputs, are interacting with the other things in the organization. And we understand those integration points, because those end up being things we need to design for, and sometimes go collaborate with those other parts of the organization to change what they're doing to have a better integration point with those other approaches. And then in step number 9, we conduct a diagnosis. Now that we know these other things in this discovery process, if you will, we can use that information to conduct a diagnosis of the current system, if there is one. This is an optional step. We sometimes skip this step on purpose, because the current system is so problematic, potentially outdated, that we just want to start with a blank sheet. And so in that case, we wouldn't waste our time on this, and we'd move straight to a design. But sometimes we're only redesigning part or doing a redesign, and there's many good things we want to keep. In that case, we would do a diagnosis so that we could identify what do we want to keep about the current design, what needs to be redesigned, and that will inform the design process. All of this is used to inform the design process. The reason we're going through these discovery steps is because we need this information in the design team before they launch off and work on those 9 different components that we were just talking about a minute ago. And that all these things inform that in a variety of different ways. And this is one of those things where there are tools that allow people to actually do a very structured approach to this. And that's often done in physical system design, where there's very specific things that we want to make sure are designed into it. And so we keep close track of that. In other organizational designs, we use this in a much more loose fashion. And these things have informed the design team's thinking before they launch off on the design process, and then incorporate them as they go. Then as they start developing the design, which goes through several iterations in the design process, from an ideal conceptual design to a feasible conceptual design to a more detailed design. All of these get used multiple times, and the team will go back and revisit this work as they have conversations about it and move forward. This sets up for the development phase, because we still need to develop, prototype, test, do limited deployment, improve, and then eventually deploy it more widely throughout the organization, which is essentially a leading change effort. But the deployment and the development never really end, because after it's deployed, there's further iterations of development that goes on to keep the design up to date. But that sums up the how you get to that design and the key factors. And in your handout, there are some resources that kind of lead you through, starting out with a very short introduction kind of approach in innovation. And then there's on the website, it walks through these steps in a little more detail. And then there's an article you can read that goes into these framework aspects in quite a bit more detail. So